In a luxurious and silent mansion, the twin daughters of widowed millionaire Lee Jin-woo knew no joy. For 3 long years, their smiles had vanished, frozen by the pain and coldness that permeated the house. No one dared to break protocol until Kim Min-ji, the new housekeeper, did the unthinkable. She took them to a forbidden place, a place where dirt and freedom met, and there, amidst the mud, the girls laughed, giggled, and smiled like never before. But what would happen when the cold and strict Lee Jin-woo arrived and caught them in the act? Would it be the end of Min-ji or the beginning of something even he couldn't predict? The deep rumble of the Mercedes-Benz S-Class engine cut through the afternoon air, a familiar sound that, for Min-ji, now sounded like the funeral march of her hopes. The black car, impeccable and luxurious, glided up the paved driveway, stopping a few feet from the scene that defied all order and decorum of the Lee mansion. The rear door opened with a soft click, and Lee Jin-woo emerged, an imposing figure in his impeccably tailored suit, an aura of power and coldness radiating from him like an invisible force field. His eyes, accustomed to the sterile perfection of his world, swept across the meticulously manicured garden and stopped abruptly. What he saw was not just mud, it was a sacrilege. His daughters, the small and delicate Lee Ji-ah and Lee Ji-yoon, whom he protected with an invisible layer of glass, were immersed in dirt. Their white dresses, now unrecognizable, were smears of brown and green. Their hair, usually tied in perfect braids, was loose and speckled with dirt. And then, the unthinkable. Their faces. Lee Jin-woo froze. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity. The smiles. He hadn't seen them in so long he'd almost forgotten what they looked like. Wide, genuine, uninhibited. Childlike laughter, pure and crystalline, echoed in the air, breaking the heavy silence that had dominated the mansion for years. It was a sound he had buried along with the memories of his wife, a sound he believed he would never hear again. Min-ji felt her blood run cold. Panic rose in her throat, a tight knot that prevented her from breathing. She saw him. The expression on Lee Jin-woo's face was a mix of shock, disbelief, and a rising fury that promised to be devastating. His eyes, previously only cold, now burned with a dangerous intensity, fixed on her, the intruder who had dared to break all the rules. "Father!" Jia cried out, her voice full of joy, oblivious to the storm brewing. She and Ji-yoon, with dirty hands and faces, ran towards their father, their little feet splashing in the mud, unaware of the imminent danger. Their smiles were so bright that for a fleeting moment they seemed to illuminate the darkness in Lee Jin-woo's eyes. But the moment passed. The sight of his daughters, dirty and disheveled, approaching him with the same joy he associated with his late wife, was too much. An invisible barrier rose between them. He took a step back, his expression hardening even more. The girls' smiles faltered, their joy slowly draining away as their father's familiar coldness hit them. Min-ji, her heart pounding erratically, knew there was no hiding. She stepped in front of the twins, like a fragile shield against the approaching wrath. Her own shoes were muddy, her housekeeper's uniform stained. She was living proof of the crime. Lee Jin-woo didn't say a word. His eyes, like sharp blades, pierced Min-ji, evaluating her, condemning her. He walked towards them, each step measured, deliberate, the sound of his expensive shoes on the clean pavement contrasting violently with the mud-soaked ground. The air grew heavy, so dense that Min-ji felt she could barely breathe. The twins, now quiet, watched their father with wide eyes, the innocence of their smiles replaced by a familiar apprehension. When he stopped a few inches from Min-ji, the shadow of his tall, imposing figure covering her, the silence that followed was deafening. There were no shouts, no immediate reprimands, only Lee Jin-woo's penetrating gaze, which seemed to see through her, to her very soul. Min-ji lifted her chin, despite her fear. She had seen the girl's smiles, and for that smile she was willing to face any consequence. Li Jinwu's eyes moved from Minji to his daughters, and then to the mud, to the discarded gardening tools, and to the mess he considered an outrage. A muscle twitched in his jaw. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low, controlled, but laden with a chill that froze her to the bone. "What is this?" He wasn't asking. It was a declaration, a sentence. And Minji knew that the fate of her brief but significant journey in that mansion hung by a thread. What would he do? Fire her? Punish the girls? Or was there something more, something that even he, the Iceman, couldn't predict, hidden behind that furious gaze? The tension was palpable, a stretched thread about to snap. The heavy, dense air seemed to suck all sound, leaving only the echo of Li Jinwu's question, as cold and sharp as an ice blade. Minji felt her heart hammer against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to suffocate her. Her eyes, fixed on his, searched for a glimmer of understanding, but found only the contained fury of a man watching his meticulously constructed world crumble into a puddle of mud. The twins, Jia and Ji-un, once overflowing with joy, now cowered behind her, their small bodies tense, their smiles faded into an expression of apprehension that Minji knew well. The sparkle in their eyes had dimmed, replaced by the familiar shadow of fear. They were happy, sir," Minji managed to murmur, her voice a barely audible thread, but laden with an undeniable truth. She couldn't lie, not after having witnessed the pure and uninhibited joy that had bloomed on the girls' faces. "They haven't smiled like that in a long time." Li Jinwu didn't move a muscle. His eyes, however, narrowed, and the muscle in his jaw twitched again. The word happy seemed an insult in his vocabulary, a fragile excuse for the disorder he saw. To him, happiness was a luxury that didn't justify breaking rules, dirt, disrespect for protocol. The Li mansion was a sanctuary of order, a monument to his own discipline and control, and Minji had desecrated its altar with dirt and childish laughter. Happiness. His voice was a dangerous whisper, more menacing than any shout. "You call this happiness, Kim Minji? Their clothes ruined, their hair tangled, exposed to dirt and germs. This is negligence. It's an affront to the order of this house and to the health of my daughters." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the girls, who now seemed even smaller and more vulnerable. "Jia, Ji-un, inside, immediately. Mrs. Park will take you for a bath. Now." The girls didn't need a second warning. With slumped shoulders and downcast eyes, they moved away from Minji, the joy of minutes ago completely extinguished. Their small steps in the mud were hesitant, and the sight of them walking away, carrying the proof of their happiness like a guilt, squeezed Minji's heart. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before, filled only by the distant sound of the twins' footsteps and Mrs. Park approaching to take them. When the mansion door closed behind the girls, Li Jinwu's icy gaze fell entirely on Minji. It was a look that promised not just reprimand, but annihilation. Minji's inner voice screamed at her to apologize, to cower, to beg for forgiveness. But the image of the girl's smiles, so vivid in her memory, prevented her. She had seen the light, and she couldn't pretend it had never existed. "You knew the rules of this house, Minji," he continued, each word a calculated blow. "You knew the protocol. You knew the importance of discipline and order, and yet on your first full day, you decided to ignore all of it. You took them to the forbidden garden, to the mud, to disorder. Why?" Minji took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. "Sir, I saw the sadness in their eyes. I saw how much they needed a moment of freedom. They didn't want to play with expensive toys or in immaculate rooms. They wanted to feel the earth, the water. They wanted to be children. She looked up at him, an unexpected courage blooming in her chest. They were laughing, sir. Truly laughing. Isn't that what matters more than a little dirt? Minji's question hung in the air, a silent challenge to Li Jinwu's cold logic. For a fleeting, almost imperceptible instant, something seemed to waver in the millionaire's eyes. A shadow, a flash of a distant memory, perhaps of his late wife's laughter, or the innocence he had lost. But the mask of coldness soon recomposed itself, denser than before. He could not allow an emotion as volatile as childish happiness to destabilize his carefully controlled world. "You're fired, Minji," Li Jinwu declared, his voice devoid of any emotion, as if he were announcing the weather. "Your salary will be paid in full until the end of the month. Pack your things and leave the mansion immediately. I will not tolerate such insubordination or recklessness. My daughters need order, not chaos." The sentence was pronounced, cold and final. Minji felt a shock run through her body. But strangely, it wasn't just despair. There was a pang of pride. She had done what she believed was right. She had brought a smile to faces that hadn't smiled in years. But the reality of the situation hit her hard. Fired, expelled. And the girls? They would return to silence, to solitude. As Li Jinwu turned to enter the mansion, his imposing figure disappearing behind the massive oak door, Minji remained there, alone in the garden, surrounded by the mud that now seemed a monument to her brief and daring rebellion. The rumble of the Mercedes-Benz engine still echoed in her ears, but now it was the sound of the door closing that sealed her fate. What would become of the twins now? And what would become of her, the housekeeper who dared to defy the Iceman in the name of a smile? The silence of the Li mansion reigned again, deeper and heavier, as if the brief explosion of joy had never existed. But Minji knew it had, and Li Jinwu, somewhere deep in his soul, knew it too. And that truth, however much he tried to suppress it, was the beginning of something even he couldn't predict. The cold, late afternoon breeze seemed to mock Minji's courage, whispering the word "fired" in her ears. The initial shock gave way to a wave of despair, but soon after, a strange calm enveloped her. She had been fired, yes. But for a brief, glorious moment, she had seen the light in the twins' eyes. She had heard their laughter, so pure and joyful that it seemed to have the power to heal. And for that she had no regrets. Her eyes swept across the garden, now silent and desolate. The puddle of mud, once a stage of unrestrained joy, was now just a dark stain on the impeccable lawn, a physical reminder of her rebellion. The gardening tools lay abandoned, like silent witnesses to a crime that, for Minji, was an act of love. The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, but the beauty of the scene could not warm the cold that had settled in her chest. What would become of the girls now? Would they return to their silent world, to their golden prison, where order and discipline suffocated any trace of spontaneity? This was the question that tormented her most. Inside the mansion, the chaos of childish joy had been quickly replaced by cold, relentless routine. Jia and Jiun, with red eyes and trembling lips, were guided by Mrs. Park to the luxurious marble bathroom. The warm bathwater with its lavender scent couldn't wash away the sadness that clung to them like the mud on their clothes. Their small hearts pounded erratically, no longer from the excitement of play, but from the pain of reprimand and Minji's sudden absence. They didn't understand why fun was wrong, why laughter was cause for fury. They only knew that the light Minji had brought into their days had been abruptly extinguished. Li Jinwu watched the scene from the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand. The image of his daughters, dirty and smiling, was still etched in his mind, a disturbing anomaly in his ordered universe. He had acted on impulse, out of anger, out of a protective instinct that manifested as control. Disorder was a threat, a reminder of life's fragility, of the loss he had suffered. He needed control, predictability, and Minji had broken all of that. "It's for their own good," he murmured to himself, trying to convince himself. "They need discipline, structure, not recklessness." But the voice of reason seemed weak against the echo of the girl's laughter. A sound he hadn't heard in so long, he'd almost forgotten its melody. In the staff quarters, Minji began to pack her few possessions. Each piece of clothing, each book, each personal item seemed heavy, laden with the irony of her situation. She had come to bring joy, to care, and now she was being expelled for having done just that. Her fingers brushed against her housekeeper's uniform, now stained with mud, a silent trophy of her brief battle. She folded it carefully, as if it were a relic, before placing it in her suitcase. The mansion, once a labyrinth of corridors and secrets, now seemed a strangely empty place. The silence that filled it was deeper, more oppressive than before. The other staff, with furtive glances and hushed whispers, avoided eye contact with Minji, as if her crime were contagious. No one dared to question Li Jinwu's decision. He was the sun around which everyone revolved, and his word was law. Minji carried her small suitcase down the long corridor, the sound of her footsteps echoing on the polished marble. As she passed the twins' bedroom door, she hesitated. She wanted to say goodbye, wanted to make sure they were okay. But she knew it would be useless, perhaps even harmful. Mrs. Park had already been instructed to keep the girls away. It was the end. When she finally reached the main door, the same door through which she had entered with hope and determination so recently, she looked back. The imposing facade of the Li mansion, lit by the nightlights, seemed even colder and more impenetrable. It was a place of wealth and power, but also of deep solitude, a solitude that even the children's smiles had not been able to completely dissipate. Minji knew she was leaving, but something inside her told her that her story with the twins was not over. The seed of joy had been planted, and even if Li Jinwu tried to water it with ice, she had seen the strength of that little flower. What would happen now? She didn't know, but the truth was that by firing her, Li Jinwu had not just expelled a housekeeper. He had expelled the only person who had dared to challenge the darkness that enveloped his family, and that decision, he would soon discover, would have far greater consequences than he could ever imagine. The silence of the night swallowed her footsteps as she walked away, leaving behind only the puddle of mud and the memory of a smile. The night breeze, once a mocking whisper, now seemed a lament, carrying with it the weight of Li Jinwu's decision. Minji walked down the long driveway, the wrought-iron gates of the Li mansion receding behind her like a broken promise. Each step was an echo on the cold asphalt, a solitary sound that marked the end of her brief journey in that place of luxury and despair. She clutched the strap of her small suitcase, feeling the cold penetrate her bones, but a stubborn flame burned in her chest. The image of the twins' smiles, as fleeting as they were precious, was her shield against the darkness of the night and the bitterness of her dismissal. She had been expelled, yes, but not defeated. She had seen the light, and that was something no one could take from her. Inside the mansion, the silence was a living entity, heavier and more suffocating than ever. Li Jinwu was in his office, the dim light of the desk lamp illuminating untouched documents. The glass of whiskey, once a refuge, now seemed a bitter reminder of his own powerlessness. He had restored order, discipline, but at what cost? The girl's laughter, that sound he had suppressed for so long, now resonated in his mind, a joyful ghost that refused to be exorcised. He tried to justify his decision, arguing that disorder was dangerous, that Minji's recklessness threatened the structure carefully built to protect his daughters. But the truth was that he had seen something in Jia and Ji-un's eyes, something he hadn't seen in 3 years, pure and uninhibited joy, and he had crushed it. Upstairs in the twins' room, Mrs. Park struggled to calm the girls. The bath, which should have been relaxing, had turned into a ritual of sadness. Jia and Ji-un refused to eat dinner, their eyes swollen from crying. Their small faces, once illuminated by the mud adventure, were now pale and marked by confusion and pain. They didn't understand why fun had ended so abruptly, why the lady who had made them laugh had disappeared. Mrs. Park, with years of experience dealing with children, felt their anguish. She had witnessed the transformation, the brief blossoming of their personalities, and now saw the return to their previous catatonic state. She tried to offer words of comfort, but the girls just cowered, their small shoulders trembling. The void left by Minji was palpable, an absence that even the luxury of their room could not fill. Lee Jin-woo, unable to concentrate, stood up and walked to the window. The night was deep, and the mansion seemed like an isolated castle in its own sadness. He had believed that control was the key to safety, to overcoming loss. But what had he controlled, in fact? Only the external expression of pain, not the pain itself. He had built walls, not bridges, and now, by expelling Minji, he had torn down the only bridge his daughters had dared to cross in years. A pang of regret, cold and sharp, pierced his armor of coldness. He had acted out of fear, out of anger, out of a desperate desire to keep everything under his dominion, and he had failed to see what truly mattered. In the twins' room, Ji-un, with a trembling sigh, picked up a small, crumpled piece of paper she had secretly kept in her pocket. It was a rudimentary drawing, made with a crayon Minji had found in the garden. 2 smiling figures, surrounded by brown smudges representing mud. Jia leaned over, her eyes fixed on the image. It was a treasure, proof that joy had existed. They hugged each other, the drawing between them, a silent pact that they would not forget that day, nor the person who had made it possible. As Minji walked away from the property, the distant sound of an approaching car made her turn her head. It wasn't a taxi, but a familiar vehicle. It was Mr. Kim's car, the Lee family's driver, which stopped beside her. He rolled down the window, his wrinkled face expressing a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Minji," he said, his voice low, "Mr. Lee asked me to take you to the bus station, and he said to give you this." He extended an envelope. Minji took it, feeling its thickness. It wasn't just her salary. There was something more. She looked at the mansion one last time, its imposing and cold silhouette against the starry sky. Lee Jin-woo's decision had been merciless, but the seed of change had been planted, and she knew, with a strange certainty, that the story of those twins and their ice father was far from over. The night swallowed her footsteps, but the memory of a smile and the promise of an uncertain future remained. Minji got into the car, the warmth of the heater a welcome contrast to the cold night. Mr. Kim drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road, but his gaze occasionally drifted to the rearview mirror, meeting Minji's. He was a man of few words, but his eyes told stories of years of silent observation, of loyalty to a family that seemed condemned to sadness. Minji clutched the envelope in her hands. Curiosity was a powerful force, but she resisted the urge to open it immediately. There was a dignity in her pain, a refusal to allow haste or anxiety to dominate that moment of farewell. "The girls, how are they?" Minji finally broke the silence, her voice an almost inaudible whisper. Mr. Kim sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire mansion. "Not well, Minji. Mrs. Park is having difficulties. They don't want to eat, they don't want to sleep. They just cry and ask for you." A sharp pang of pain pierced Minji's chest. It was exactly what she feared. Joy was such a rare visitor in those children's lives that its absence was now even crueler. She had planted a seed, but who would water it now? In the car, Minji finally opened the envelope. Besides the due salary, there was a considerable amount of money, much more than she expected, and a small note. The handwriting was firm, but there was a noticeable hesitation in some letters. Minji, the note began without formalities. Accept this as compensation for the inconvenience, and, please, do not mention what happened to anyone. It was an attempt to silence her, to buy her silence, but Minji felt something more. A pang of guilt, perhaps. A tacit acknowledgement that he knew what he had lost, even if he couldn't admit it. She folded the note and put it away, the stack of money feeling heavy in her lap. It was a fortune for her, but it wasn't what she wanted. She wanted the joy back in the twins' eyes. The car stopped at the bus station, city lights blinking in the distance. "Thank you, Mr. Kim," she said, her voice firm, "for everything." He nodded, his eyes expressing a tacit understanding. "Take care, Minji, and don't forget the girls. They won't forget you." Minji got out of the car, her suitcase in one hand, the envelope in the other. As Mr. Kim's car drove away, she looked up at the night sky, the full moon hanging like an observing eye. Lee Jin-woo had tried to extinguish the light, but the seed of joy had been planted, and Minji, even expelled, felt that her destiny was intrinsically linked to that of the twins. The story had not ended. It had merely branched out, promising a reunion that no one could predict, not even the cold and calculating Lee Jin-woo. The tension hung in the air, a premonition that the imposed order would be challenged once more, and the consequences would be inevitable. Mrs. Park, exhausted, came downstairs, the muffled sounds of the girls' sobs still echoing in her ears. She found Lee Jin-woo standing in the living room, the darkness of the night reflected in his eyes. "Mr. Lee," she began, her voice laden with contained frustration. "The girls won't stop crying. They haven't eaten and don't want to sleep. They only call for Minji." Lee Jin-woo's face remained impassive, but Mrs. Park could feel the crack in his facade. "I've tried everything. They're clutching a drawing of mud. They don't understand why their joy was taken away." Mrs. Park's words were a direct hit, each syllable a hammer blow to the armor Lee Jin-woo had built. He turned to her, his eyes dark and troubled. "Make them sleep, Mrs. Park. They need rest." His voice was a command, but it sounded empty, without its former authority. Mrs. Park merely sighed, shaking her head slightly before returning upstairs, her expression saying more than any words. Lee Jin-woo stood alone in the immense room, the silence now filled with the mental echoes of his daughter's cries and Mrs. Park's words. The mansion, which was once his sanctuary of control, now seemed like a prison, every corner reminding him of his failure. He had believed that money and discipline could solve everything, but what had he bought? Only more sadness. He had tried to silence Minji with a generous sum, but what he was really trying to silence was the voice of his own conscience. The image of the twins' smiles in the mud, so vivid in his memory, was a torture. He had seen the freedom in their eyes, the innocence he thought he had lost forever, and he, in his blindness, had ripped that freedom from them. The note he had written to Minji, asking for silence, now seemed pathetic. How could he silence the truth that screamed in his own ears? He walked to the window again, looking out into the darkness. The bus station, where Minji would now be, seemed a distant point of light in a world he had tried to control, but which now slipped from his hands. The seed of joy had been planted, and he, the ice gardener, had tried to uproot it. But the roots were deeper than he imagined. He felt a growing urgency, a silent desperation that propelled him. He had lost control, yes, But perhaps that was exactly what he needed to finally see. The night advanced, but for Lee Jinwoo, the darkness was just beginning to dissipate, revealing a painful but necessary truth. The tension in the mansion was not just the absence of joy, but the suffocating presence of guilt and regret, promising that the calm before the storm was about to end. The night, which had dragged on, now seemed to have grown wings, flying with the urgency Lee Jinwoo felt in his chest. Minji's words, delivered by Mr. Kim, resonated in his mind like an alarm bell. The girl's joy is priceless, and mud can be washed away, but sadness is harder to clean. It was a simple truth, brutal in its clarity, and he, in his arrogance, had tried to silence it with money. The phone, heavy in his hand, was thrown onto the mahogany table. There was no time to think, only to act. The meticulous businessman, the distant and controlled father, had been replaced by a desperate version of himself, driven by a love he had kept locked away for too long. He ran out of the office, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the mansion. "Mr. Kim." His voice, usually calm and authoritative, was tinged with an almost feverish urgency. He found the driver in the kitchen, finishing his tea. Mr. Kim turned, surprised by the intensity in his boss's gaze. "Prepare the car, now. We need to find Minji." Mr. Kim hesitated. "Mr. Lee? But she must have already taken the bus. The main station is far, and at this hour." "I know." Lee Jinwoo interrupted him, his frustration evident. "But she said something to you. She said the girl's joy is priceless, and I need to fix this." The confession, almost a whisper, was something Mr. Kim would never expect to hear from his boss. It was the crack in the armor, proof that Lee Jinwoo's humanity still existed. The driver, realizing the seriousness of the situation, nodded without further questions. In a few minutes, the car was at the door. Lee Jinwoo got in, the silence of the back seat now filled with the hum of his own mind. The night city passed them by, a blur of lights and shadows. Every traffic light, every slow car, was torture. Where would she be? What bus would she have taken? He had underestimated Minji. He had seen her only as a housekeeper, an interruption to the order he so prized. But she was more than that. She was the bridge to his daughter's joy, the only person who had managed to penetrate the barrier of sadness he had inadvertently built around them. "To the main bus station," he instructed Mr. Kim, his voice firm, but his heart pounding erratically, "and then to all secondary stations, no matter how long it takes." Mr. Kim drove efficiently, but the night was a labyrinth. The main station was almost empty, just a few scattered travelers and the last buses departing for distant destinations. Lee Jinwoo got out of the car, his eyes scanning the place. There was no sign of her. The hope, which had begun to sprout, threatened to wither. He approached the information counter, something he, a man of power and influence, would never do. "Have you seen a young woman, short, with a gentle smile, perhaps a bit down?" He found himself describing Minji, not as a housekeeper, but as the person who had brought light into his home. The sleepy attendant shook her head. "Many people pass through here, sir. I don't remember." Frustration was a knot in his throat. He had tried to buy her silence, and now, desperately, he tried to find her voice. The irony was cruel. He had tried to control the uncontrollable, and now he was at the mercy of chance, the vastness of the night, and the decision of a young woman he had dismissed. Back in the car, Mr. Kim watched his boss with a mixture of concern and admiration. He had never seen Lee Jinwoo so vulnerable, so human. "Mr. Lee, perhaps she went to a relative's house, or to another city. It's a difficult search." "We can't give up," Lee Jinwoo replied, his voice hoarse. "The girls, they can't wait any longer. I can't wait any longer." He thought of his daughters, huddled in their beds, clutching the mud drawing. The image was a dagger in his heart. He had failed them in a way that money could never fix. The search continued, from one bus station to another, through the dark and silent streets of the city. Every empty stop was a blow, every passing minute an eternity. He remembered the twins' smiles, the laughter he hadn't heard in years. Minji had brought that back, and he, in his blindness, had ripped it away. Guilt was a heavy burden, but determination was stronger. He wasn't just looking for Minji. He was looking for a chance at redemption, for a way to heal the wounds he himself had inflicted. The night advanced and the city seemed to sleep, but for Li Jinwu, the journey was just beginning. He knew that if he failed to find Minji, the darkness in his mansion and in his daughters' hearts could be permanent. The tension was palpable, a thread stretched to its limit, promising that the desperate search for Minji was just the beginning of a long and uncertain road to reconciliation. He had to find her. There was no other option. The clock on the car's dashboard read almost 3 in the morning. The streets, once bustling, were now empty veins of a sleeping city, dotted only by streetlights that cast long, distorted shadows. Mr. Kim, though exhausted, remained steady at the wheel, his loyalty to his boss overcoming his fatigue. He watched Li Jinwu in the rearview mirror, the businessman's face, usually so impassive, now marked by deep anguish. "Mr. Li," the driver broke the silence, his voice soft. "Do you remember if Minji mentioned where she was from, or if she had a specific place to go?" The question hit Li Jinwu like a shock. In all his interactions with Minji, he had never bothered to know such personal details. She was just the housekeeper. The irony was brutal. He had refused to see her as a complete human being, and now that gap in knowledge was an insurmountable chasm. "No," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper laden with self-reproach. I didn't ask." The confession was a blow to his ego, but a liberation for his soul. He was shedding the layers of control and arrogance that had isolated him. Suddenly, a fleeting memory. One day, while the girls were playing in the garden, Minji had spoken about wildflowers, about how they grew freely, without the need for planned gardens. She had mentioned something about her grandmother, who lived in a small town in the countryside, where the air was pure and flowers grew everywhere. It was a vague memory, almost insignificant at the time, but now it shone like a beacon in the darkness. "Wait," Li Jinwu said, straightening up in his seat, a new energy coursing through his body. She spoke about her grandmother, in a small town in the countryside, where flowers grow everywhere. Mr. Kim, a practical man, frowned. "Mr. Li, the countryside is vast, and at this hour, buses to those towns have long since departed. Even if she took one, finding her would be like looking for a needle in a haystack." "It doesn't matter," Li Jinwu retorted, his determination renewed. "If she spoke about a place where flowers grow freely, where there is purity, that's where she would go. That's where she would find solace." He was beginning to understand Minji, not through documents or resumes, but through the essence of who she was, her simple and gentle soul. The bridge he had destroyed, he now tried to rebuild with every fragment of memory, every intuition. He picked up the phone again, this time not to throw it, but to use it. "Mr. Kim, do you have the contact for the employment agency that sent her?" The driver nodded, pulling out his own cell phone. "Yes, sir, I can call them." "Not now," Li Jinwu interrupted him. "It's too late, but as soon as day breaks, call. Ask for her residential address, contact information for relatives, everything they can provide." He knew it was a desperate measure, perhaps even ineffective, but it was a path. The search was transforming. It was no longer just a race against time to find a body in a terminal. It was a search for a soul, for a piece of hope he had crushed. He remembered his daughter's smiles, the way Minji had looked at them, with a tenderness that he, in his rigidity, had forgotten how to express. Guilt still gnawed at him, but now a new emotion began to blossom alongside it. Hope. Hope that it wasn't too late. Hope that sadness, however deep, could still be cleaned. The car drove on, leaving the city behind, entering the dark roads that led to the countryside. The night was still long and the path uncertain. But, for the first time in a long time, Li Jinwu felt he was driving in the right direction, not just geographically, but in his own heart. The tension had not diminished. It had concentrated, transforming into a silent energy, a promise that he would not give up, not until joy returned to his home and to the hearts of his daughters, and perhaps to his own. The darkness of the night began to recede, not with a sudden burst, but with the delicacy of a veil slowly lifting. The grey tones of pre-dawn painted the horizon, transforming the silhouettes of trees into defined outlines against the sky that promised the sun. Li Jinwu's car continued its journey, tearing through the silence of the early morning. The clock on the dashboard marked the first hours of the day, and with them a new layer of anxiety settled in the businessman's heart. The girls would be waking soon. What would they feel when they realized Minji's absence? The image of their sad faces, which he had tried to erase with money and control, now haunted him with painful clarity. He looked out the window, the urban landscape giving way to open fields and small hills. The air, once heavy with city pollution, now felt lighter, purer. It was as if nature itself was offering a stark contrast to the life he had led, and to the life Minji seemed to embrace. He had built an empire of concrete and glass, but she had found joy in the simplicity of the earth and flowers. "Mr. Li!" Mr. Kim's voice broke Li Jinwu's trance. The driver had pulled the car over to the shoulder, his cell phone in hand. "It's time. I'll call the agency." Li Jinwu nodded, the knot in his throat tightening. He watched Mr. Kim dial, the wait stretching like an eternity. The sun was beginning to peek out, gilding the clouds and revealing the raw beauty of the countryside. Every second was a reminder that Minji was drifting further away, perhaps to a place where he would never find her. Mr. Kim's conversation was brief, punctuated by, "Yes, sir, and I understand." The driver's face, usually impassive, showed a slight frustration. Li Jinwu knew, even before Mr. Kim hung up, that the news would not be good. "Mr. Li," Mr. Kim began, turning to his boss, "the agency said Minji hadn't provided a fixed residential address on her resume, only an emergency contact for her grandmother. But they didn't have the full address, just the city name, Gyeongju, and her grandmother's phone wasn't answering. Gyeongju, the ancient capital, a city rich in history but also vast, and her grandmother's contact, the only concrete clue, was silent. The hope that had begun to sprout withered again, replaced by a growing sense of despair. It was as if the universe was conspiring to punish him for his arrogance. "Gyeongju?" Li Jinwu repeated, the word sounding empty. "It's a big city, Mr. Kim. How will we find her there?" The agency said she mentioned a small village on the outskirts of Gyeongju, where her grandmother cultivated flowers for the local market. But there's no name, just the description. Mr. Kim seemed as disheartened as his boss. A flower village. The description resonated with Minji's memory of talking about wildflowers. It was a clue, however tenuous. Li Jinwu closed his eyes, trying to visualize Minji, trying to understand her logic, her feelings. She wouldn't seek the hustle and bustle of the city. She would seek peace, simplicity, the place where life flourished without human interference. "To Gyeongju," Li Jinwu ordered, his voice regaining some firmness. And when we get there, we'll look for villages that cultivate flowers. We'll ask in each one." Mr. Kim started the car, and they returned to the road. The sun was already high, and the day promised to be long. The journey to Gyeongju was a few hours, but the search within the city and its surroundings could take days or even weeks. Lee Jin-woo picked up the phone again, this time to call the mansion. Mrs. Park, the housekeeper, answered with a sleepy voice. "Mrs. Park, have the girls woken up yet?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "Not yet, Mr. Lee, but it's almost time. Minji isn't here to prepare them." The housekeeper's voice was neutral, but Lee Jin-woo felt the implication. Minji's absence was already noted. "Don't worry, Mrs. Park. I'm resolving an important matter. Please take care of the girls. Tell them I'll be back soon." He hung up, guilt gnawing at him even more. He had promised himself he wouldn't fail them again, but here he was, absent, on an uncertain search. He looked at the mud drawing that was still in his pocket. The girls' smiles, the genuine joy he had witnessed. That was what he was looking for. It wasn't Min-ji the person, but what she represented, the key to his daughter's happiness and perhaps his own. He had tried to buy happiness, silence, control, but Min-ji had shown that the most precious things were priceless. The road to Gyeongju was picturesque, with verdant rice fields and distant mountains. Every kilometer took them further from their previous life and led him to a world he barely knew. He remembered the way Min-ji had spoken about the beauty of simple things, about the connection to the earth. He, who lived in a world of business and transactions, was now at the mercy of intuition and hope. "Mr. Lee," Mr. Kim said, his voice a little more animated, "we're approaching Gyeongju. There's a tourist information center at the city entrance. Perhaps they can give us a map of the rural villages, especially those known for their flowers." It was an idea, a small light at the end of a very long tunnel. Lee Jin-woo felt a glimmer of hope. He had underestimated Minji, had underestimated the power of simplicity and kindness. Now he was learning, the hard way, that true wealth was not in his bank account, but in his daughter's smiles, and in the gentle soul of a young woman he had dismissed. The tension was a stretched rope, but now there was a deeper purpose in his urgency. It wasn't just to fix a mistake, but to embrace a truth he had ignored for too long. He had to find her, not just for his daughters, but for himself. The journey to Gyeongju was more than a search. It was a pilgrimage. The landscape of Gyeongju unfolded before them, a tapestry of history and nature. Ancient temples and stone pagodas emerged between gentle hills, enveloped in a morning mist that seemed to guard millennial secrets. For Lee Jin-woo, accustomed to the frantic pace and cold gleam of Seoul, the city was an anachronism, a reminder of a time he had forgotten. Every stone, every centuries-old tree seemed to whisper of a life lived in harmony with the earth, a life that Min-ji seemed to personify. The car stopped in front of the Tourist Information Center, a modern building that contrasted slightly with the scenery. Lee Jin-woo got out, feeling the fresh, damp morning air. There was no time to appreciate the beauty. Urgency was a whip at his back. Mr. Kim was already inside, speaking with a young attendant who seemed overwhelmed by tourist demands. "We're looking for villages on the outskirts of Gyeongju, known for cultivating flowers," Mr. Kim explained, showing the map the attendant had provided. The young woman, with a tired smile, pointed to several green patches on the map. "Sir, Gyeongju is surrounded by many agricultural villages. Almost all of them cultivate some kind of flower, whether for the market or for the temples. There's Camellia Village, Wild Rose Village, and many others that cultivate seasonal flowers." The answer, though helpful, was overwhelming. "Isn't there one that's more prominent, or that has a longer history with flowers?" Lee Jin-woo intervened, his voice laden with an impatience he struggled to contain. The attendant frowned, thinking, Well, there's Seonam village. It's a bit further out, but it's famous for its wildflowers and for having a community of flower growers who cultivate them more traditionally, without many chemicals. They say the flowers there have a unique scent. Seonam, wildflowers, traditional. The description resonated with the image Lee Jin-woo had built of Minji. It was a clue, perhaps the most concrete they had. To Seonam, he ordered, returning to the car. The journey to Seonam was an even deeper immersion into the countryside. Asphalt roads gave way to dirt tracks, flanked by verdant rice fields that shimmered under the morning sun. Small, grey-roofed houses dotted the landscape, and the smell of wet earth and fresh vegetation filled the air. Lee Jin-woo looked out the window, every detail of the landscape seeming like a fragment of a world he had ignored. He remembered Minji's hands, dirty with earth, and his daughter's smiles, stained with mud. The irony was cruel. He had despised the earth, and now he was at its mercy, searching for a woman who loved it. Guilt gnawed at him. He had been blind, arrogant, so focused on his own grief and control that he hadn't noticed the beauty and life Minji had brought into his home. He had tried to cage his daughter's happiness, and Minji, with her simplicity, had opened the cage door. As they approached Seonam, the landscape began to change. The rice fields gave way to extensive plantations of vibrantly colored flowers. Daisies, cosmos, lavender, and flowers unknown to him stretched as far as the eye could see, forming a fragrant mosaic. The air was sweet, and the buzzing of bees was the only soundtrack. It was a paradise, a stark contrast to the grayness of the city. "Mr. Lee, look," Mr. Kim pointed to a small wooden sign, almost hidden among the flowers, that read, "Welcome to Seonam Village, home of wildflowers." The car entered the village, which was even smaller than Lee Jin-woo imagined. Traditional wooden and tiled houses lined narrow streets, and flower pots adorned every window and door. Children played in a small stream, and older women worked in their gardens, their gloved hands in the earth. It was a scene of peace and simplicity he had never imagined existed. Mr. Kim stopped the car in front of a small grocery store, the only apparent point of commerce. "I'll ask around here, Mr. Lee. Maybe someone knows Minji's grandmother." Lee Jin-woo nodded, his heart pounding. The tension was almost unbearable. He watched Mr. Kim enter the store, and his eyes swept the village. Would she be here? Would he find her? And if he did, what would he say? How would he ask forgiveness for his blindness, for his cruelty? His eyes fell on a flower field a little further away, where a solitary figure worked, bent over the plants. It was a woman wearing a straw hat and simple clothes, her hands agile among the flowers. There was something familiar in the silhouette, in the way she moved with a natural grace, almost part of the earth. A wave of adrenaline coursed through Lee Jin-woo. Was it her? Could it be? He opened the car door without waiting for Mr. Kim. His feet carried him towards the field, the scent of the flowers intensifying with each step. His heart beat in his chest like a war drum. He had to know, he had to see. The truth was just a few feet away, hidden among the petals and leaves. The pilgrimage was reaching its climax, and what he would find, he didn't know. But he was ready to face anything. Each step Lee Jin-woo took on the soft earth of the flower field echoed his own journey, a muffled sound of regret and hope. The sweet, intoxicating scent of wildflowers, which he would once have considered a distraction, now seemed to envelop him. A fragrance of a world Minji had opened for him. His eyes were fixed on the figure ahead, his heart pounding with an intensity he hadn't felt in years, perhaps since the day he lost his wife. It wasn't the anxiety of a closed deal or a successful transaction, but the vertigo of a man on the verge of a revelation, of a truth that could change everything. As he approached, the woman's details began to materialize. The straw hat, which barely covered her simply tied dark hair. the cotton clothes stained with dirt that spoke of honest, hard work. And then she straightened up, turning slightly to pick a flower. In that instant, Lee Jinwoo's world stopped. There was no longer any doubt. It was Minji. Her face, once marked by sadness and resignation, now held a serenity he had never seen in his mansion. There was a sparkle in her eyes, a calm in her movements, that contrasted painfully with the image of the frightened, overwhelmed young woman he had known. She was in her element, connected to the earth, to the life he had disdained. Minji didn't see him immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the flowers in her hands, a small bouquet of daisies and cosmos, as if she were conversing with them. Lee Jinwoo hesitated, his voice caught in his throat. What would he say? How to begin? The words he had rehearsed during the long journey seemed empty and insufficient in the face of that vision of peace. He cleared his throat, a low sound that in the silence of the field seemed like thunder. Minji lifted her head, her eyes wide with surprise. The bouquet of flowers fell from her hands, the colorful petals scattering across the dirt. The serene smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of shock and then of fear. It was the same look he had seen in her eyes when he confronted her about the mud, when he had fired her, that look of a wounded soul which he had caused. Minji, he managed to say, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. The formality of the greeting sounded strange in the middle of that flower field, a remnant of his cold, distant world. She took a step back, as if he were an apparition, a ghost from a past she hoped to have left behind. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The fear in her eyes was a thorn in Lee Jinwoo's heart. He had come to ask forgiveness, to beg, but his mere presence seemed to rekindle the pain he had inflicted. I'm sorry, he continued, taking a step forward, his hands outstretched in a gesture of supplication he never imagined he would make. I know I have no right to be here. I know what I did was unforgivable. Minji finally found her voice, but it was just a whisper, laden with deep hurt. Why are you here, Mr. Lee? Her eyes didn't leave him, but there was a distance in her, an invisible barrier he had erected between them. I came for you, and for the girls, he replied, the urgency in his voice growing. They miss you, Minji. They haven't smiled since you left. I didn't know what you meant to them, to us. I was blind. I was a fool. He took another step closer, ignoring her hesitation. I saw the drawing, the mud drawing they made. I saw their smiles, Minji, the smiles I hadn't seen in years, and I realized you weren't just a housekeeper. You were the key to their happiness, and perhaps to my own. The words poured out of him like a torrent, disorganized, but full of a genuine emotion he had kept repressed for so long. He wasn't just asking her to come back. He was stripping off his armor, revealing the wound her absence had opened. Minji looked at him, her eyes scanning his face, as if trying to find any falsehood in his words. The expression of fear began to mix with a hint of surprise, perhaps even confusion. I don't understand, Mr. Lee. You fired me. You said I was irresponsible, that I didn't understand what was best for your daughters. I was wrong, he exclaimed, his voice cracking. I was so trapped in my own pain, in my own control, that I couldn't see the life you were bringing to them. I was trying to buy their happiness, and you took them to play in the mud. You taught them to smile again, to feel the joy of being a child. I didn't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that. At that moment, Mr. Kim, breathless, reached them, stopping at a respectful distance. He looked from Lee Jinwoo to Minji, feeling the palpable tension in the air. But Lee Jinwoo barely noticed him. His eyes were fixed on Minji, pleading. Please, Minji, he said, his voice almost a lament. Come back to us. Come back to the girls. They need you. I need you. I promise it will be different. I promise I will learn. I promise I will never again try to cage their happiness. I just want to see them smile again." The words hung in the air, laden with the weight of his regret and the fragility of his hope. Minji looked at the flowers scattered on the ground, then at Li Jinwu, her eyes welling up. The decision was not just about her, but about the two small souls she had left behind. The tension was a rope stretched to its maximum, and the future of all of them depended on her answer. Minji looked at Li Jinwu, and the flower field, once a sanctuary of peace, became a stage for the silent battle of her soul. His words, laden with such raw and unexpected regret, clashed against the wall of hurt she had built. The echo of her dismissal, of the harsh words that had wounded her, still resonated in her ears. How could such a cold and calculating man, who had judged and discarded her so easily, suddenly transform into someone begging for her presence? Her eyes, once tearful with pain, now reflected deep confusion. She saw the genuine despair on his face, the vulnerability he had never allowed anyone to see. It was the image of a broken man, not by business failure, but by the loss of life's purest essence, his daughter's joy. And somehow she was the key to that joy. "Mr. Li," she began, her voice still a whisper but with a new firmness. "You don't understand. It's not just about the girls. It's about what you did. You made me feel invisible, disposable, as if my love for them, my way of caring for them, had no value at all." The words hit Li Jinwu like a blow. He lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. "I know," he replied, his voice choked, "and there's nothing I can say or do to erase that. But I swear, Minji, that I've learned. I saw the emptiness your absence left, not just in the girls, but in the house, in me." He lifted his eyes again, and this time there was an intensity in them that went beyond desperation. It was the promise of a man who had seen the abyss and was willing to climb back, whatever the cost. "I don't just want you to come back to take care of them. I want you to come back to teach us to live again, to laugh again, to feel the earth beneath our feet, to see the beauty in simple things. I was an absent father, a man blinded by grief and pride. You opened my eyes, even when I tried to close them." Minji looked at the fallen flowers on the ground, the daisies and cosmos she had picked with such care. Those flowers were a symbol of her new life, of the freedom and peace she had found away from the cold mansion. But the girls were the reason she had endured so much, the reason she had smiled even when her heart was heavy. The image of Jia and Jiyun, their small, serious faces, their eyes that once shone with the joy of mud, now probably dull again. That thought was a torment. She had allowed herself to love them, and that love was an invisible chain that bound her to them, no matter the distance. What if I come back and you're the same?" she asked, doubt still present in her voice. "What if you try to control their happiness again? What if you fire me again because I let them play in the rain, or because they got their expensive clothes dirty?" Li Jinwu took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "I won't be the same," he promised, his voice firm and full of conviction. "I can't be. I saw what I lost. I saw what they lost. I don't want a silent house anymore, Minji. I want a house full of laughter, of life, of mud, if necessary." A small, sad smile played on his lips. "I even bought myself some rubber boots." Mr. Kim, who had been observing the scene in silence, cleared his throat softly, a sound that momentarily broke the tension. His eyes, which had witnessed his boss's transformation, conveyed a message of support and hope to Minji. Minji closed her eyes for an instant, breathing in the sweet air of the field. The decision was not easy. It meant leaving the peace she had found, to return to a world that had hurt her. But it also meant returning to the two small souls who had stolen her heart. She opened her eyes and looked at Li Jinwu. The armor of coldness he used to wear was completely shattered. He stood there, vulnerable, asking for a second chance, not just for her, but for himself, for his family. I can't promise it will be easy, Mr. Li, she said, her voice stronger now. Trust is something that's built, and you broke it. But I miss them. I miss their smiles. A ray of hope illuminated Li Jinwu's face. So, you'll come back? He asked, almost fearing the answer. Minji looked at the fallen flowers, then at the bouquet Li Jinwu had brought for her. Still in the car, she bent down, gathering the daisies and cosmos, her hands agile and gentle. I will return, Mr. Li, she replied, standing up, a small improvised bouquet in her hands. But not as a housekeeper who can be discarded. I will return as someone who cares for your daughters and who hopes you have truly changed. An immense relief flooded Li Jinwu. He felt a lump in his throat, emotion overwhelming him. Thank you, Minji, he managed to say, his voice hoarse with gratitude. Thank you very much. He took a step forward, and this time Minji did not recoil. Their eyes met, and in that gaze there was the promise of a new beginning. Not an easy beginning, but a true beginning, built on regret, hope, and the unbreakable connection the little twins had forged between them. The pilgrimage had come to an end, but the real journey, the journey of healing and rebuilding, was just beginning. And, for the first time in a long time, Li Jinwu felt he was no longer alone to walk it. He had Minji, and with her the promise of laughter, of mud, and of a future where happiness would not be caged, but cultivated, like the wildflowers of that village.